welcome to Fasken's 13th consecutive mining series. My name is Paul Fornazzari. I'm with Fasken's. Today's session we've titled 13th Annual Latin American Mining Update, Danger Ahead, Hard Hats and Steel Toe Boots Required. This is a nod, I think, in my mind, to what's happening globally, and I think that's affecting mining all over the world. The war in Ukraine, tensions with Russia, the whole issue affecting critical minerals, how the U.S. Is kind of leading the West towards setting up what I would call a fence around them so that the West can develop their critical mineral infrastructure towards, catching up to Asia in regards to electric vehicles and lithium-ion batteries. So there's a lot going on that I think is affecting mining, and we've got an amazing panel here that is expert not only in mining but understanding risks around mining. I'll introduce the group here. We've got John Price from America's Market Intelligence. He's going to lead the panel discussion. He is an expert in risk, and he's written a number of little booklets that cover risk in Latin America really well. The last one came out, I think, 12 months ago, and is really well done. In Chile, in Chilean, I would say te pasaste with your booklet. It's so good. Anyway, I recommend it highly. So he'll lead the discussion, and our panel are some of the leading mining lawyers from Latin America. María Isabel Aillón is with Perez, Bustamante, Ponce from Ecuador. Oscar Benavides with Rodrigo, Elías, and Medrano, leading partner in mining in Peru. Ignacio Celorrio, partner at Alfaro Abogados, a good friend of mine from Argentina. Gonzalo Grez, partner from Cariola, Díez, and Pérez-Cotapos from Chile. Álvaro José Rodríguez from Posse, Herrera, Ruiz from Colombia. Jorge Sanchez, the Haynes and Boones from Mexico. Carlos Vilhena, Piñera Neto from Brazil. And Jaime Saldumbide también also from Perez Bustamante from Ecuador. So with that, I'll pass it over to John, and we'll kick this off. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul. Good morning, everyone. Great to be back here. I had the pleasure of meeting Paul about 5 years ago when we first published what he was talking about, where we divided risk in Latin America into 7 areas. And the report of which he just referred to, is there's a few copies outside, is how we sort of analyze the countries in Latin America through these 7 risk paradigms. And it proved to be pretty controversial. But the 7 risk paradigms, I think, are not very controversial. And the thing about risk in any mining jurisdiction is how interwoven they are. You can't just look at security issues. You can't just look at community opposition. You can't just look at legal and regulatory risk on their own. They're all feeding off of each other. And the individuals that we've gathered here today, I've had the pleasure of working with over the last 5 years. This is a rare opportunity to hear from some of the brightest mining legal minds in Latin America. And for the next hour or so, you don't have to pay for it. So ask as many questions as you can. We've put together a series of questions around some of these risk issues. It was very complicated to come up with a seating plan. But Carlos Vilhena of Brazil suggested that the countries that had won the most World Cup should have first access to the couch in the front row. So thank you, Carlos, for that. It's very interesting, Paul's opening remarks about Russia and the war in Ukraine, and that certainly is a global issue. But in Latin America, I would contend that the biggest risk issue today is a direct result of COVID. No region in the world was more impacted by COVID than Latin America. And over the last 30 years, in almost all Latin American countries, it's been a bit bumpy, but there's been a steady progression in the improvement of distribution of wealth. Most of it is because of demographics, but sometimes some smart government policies as well. But half of that progress, 15 years of that progress, was wiped out during 9 months of quarantines. The quarantines in some countries, particularly Peru, Colombia, and Chile, were some of the strictest in the world. And you had 60% of the population, that's the percentage of the working population that works informally in Latin America. They were told that tomorrow you can't go out and work. So their incomes went from 100 to 0. And the people who told them were 30-year-old technocrats working in governments from the comfort of their own homes, working on Zoom. So you can imagine the rancor, the anger that this caused. And as a result, every election in Latin America since the beginning of 2021 has caused either a kicking out of the government if it was a presidential election, or a weakening of the legislative majority of the government in power. The only exceptions being Venezuela and Nicaragua, which one could argue are not democracies. So this has been a consistent wave, and it's not, most people have interpreted this as a move to the left. In some cases that's been the case, in other cases it's been a move to the right. Politics is moving to the right in Argentina, it moved to the right in Ecuador, it moved to the right in the Dominican Republic. It is about kicking the bums out of power. It is about kicking the establishment out of power. The problem with that is that it brings in populists. And populists generally make their decisions based upon what is politically expedient and not economically smart. And as a result, mining, which is always being the political football of the region, in other words, the historical baggage that comes with the mining industry has always made it a political target. And this round of populists that have come into power have also singled out mining as a target. And that has caused enormous unease, which makes today's panel, I think, all the more useful to us all to understand what's really going on. Because I assure you, after 10 minutes of discussion this morning with Oscar Benavides of Peru, what we hear about, particularly in newspapers like the Globe and Mail, about what's going on in Peru is not representative of what's going on in Peru. Unfortunately, the international press, which is incredibly under-resourced in its coverage of Latin America, gets it wrong most of the time, particularly when they look at Latin America through the prism of left and right, which only is a facade. Because what's going on in Latin America beneath that facade of left versus right is much more complex and a very different story. So I'm going to begin our discussion talking about what we call the risk of political interference, as well as legal and regulatory issues. So we're talking about the risk that comes directly out of the political messaging and the policy making in the capital cities of these countries. And I'm going to ask all of our panel, or all of the countries represented on our panel, to comment on, I'm going to lay out a few questions here. Where do national governments stand on mining today? How has the view changed since a year ago? What legal and regulatory changes should we be aware of or in anticipation of in light of the changes politically? So these are the questions I'm laying out. Anybody in particular want to go first? Gonzalo, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Yes, I think that the first question for a Chilean standpoint is a kind of tricky, because in Chile, the political parties supporting the current administration basically have two hearts, two visions. So you can see that, for instance, the Communist Party, which is one of the political parties supporting this administration, might be friendly to the idea of nationalized mining. But in turn, the Socialist Party, who is also a very relevant player on this administration, will be against that. So during the last 12 months, we have seen a constant tension within the coalition with different views. And we are facing new regulation. We are facing a second constitutional process. But I think that it is important to say that the Ministry of Mine, Mrs. Marcela Nando, said a few months ago that, that no nationalization of the mining industry will happen because Chile is a mining country, acknowledging that Chile is somehow in the middle of a networking of international investment treaties that provide protection to the mining industry and also to the mining investors. So she was very clear in terms that even though this internal tension within the coalition, there is no plan or idea to nationalize mining or to implement measures toward that directions. I think that the Chilean government stands today in a way that they support the mining industry. They acknowledge all the benefit that the mining industry have led in terms of transitioning to renewable, in terms of management of water through desalination plants. But we might see some political pressures in terms to strengthen the presence of state-owned company in certain minerals, mostly lithium, of course, but without affecting the existing right, the existing project. And probably we will see a JV between state-owned companies and private companies, either local or international, because the government needs the money, but also needs the technology. So we are living a kind of ambivalent moment because of this internal division, but also with the government being very clear that Chile is a mining country, and therefore our policies should lead to benefit from that.
You know, Gonzalo, you raised a really good point. There is this big difference between countries where the political class recognize that they are essentially a mining country, and that they, at the end of the day, they don't want to sacrifice their ability to continue attracting investment and generating income. Peru is another country that I would say is in that boat. As much as the dysfunction in Congress over the last decade, there is an understanding in the political class. But Peru, of course, has gone through a very tumultuous few months. Austria, can you comment on that?
Of course, thanks. As you well know, Peru didn't make it to the World Cup, but we had a new objective to set a world record, and we had 6 presidents in 7 years, which is absolutely shameful. And just a couple of months ago, our at that time president, Mr. Castillo, attempted a coup. Failed. I'd never seen all the Peruvian political and legal institutions working so well during one day at that time. So the guy was sacked with the votes of his own colleagues, left-wing radical guys. And that has changed the view, I would say, of the government towards mining. The last year or so that Mr. Castillo was in office, I wouldn't say that he had an anti-mining view, but clearly didn't like it and clearly did nothing for it. Now, this has changed. And a measure to see that is that in this PDAC, the Peruvian delegation is very, very strong, perhaps the strongest that I've seen from people coming from the government. I don't know how, but we've managed to bring the Prime Minister here, the Minister of Economy, Energy and Mines, and a set of very high-ranking officers of the government. And you have to remember that the current president, which is a lady, Dina Boluarte, was the vice president of Castillo. So she was apparently a radical as well. But now she has perhaps a different view of things now that she's in office. And we're discussing with John, sometime in the campaigns, they're very, very leftist and popular, and when they're in office, they moderate a bit. So now the Peruvian government, and they've been very active throughout the PDAC, giving that speech. They're conveying everyone that wants to hear that Peru is safe to invest, that things are going to be more stable, and that all investments are welcome. Which I guess is true, in a way. It's true. There's still risk. Some guy was saying in Peru some weeks ago that the most stable feature of Peru is instability, in terms of political instability. But the good thing, and I shouldn't be saying this that way, is that no one has enough power in Peru to introduce relevant changes at the end of the day. So if we are thinking of asking the question, are there going to be dramatic changes to deteriorate the mining investment? Not at all. If there are going to be changes, those changes, that's what the government was saying yesterday in the Peru Day at PDAC, should be to ease permitting and to promote exploration and to permit projects to move ahead as they should. And they haven't been treated that way in that last year or so. So again, I think that there's room to be an optimist on things. You know what's the definition of a pessimist, right? A well-informed optimist. So now we should be optimists for the time being, but only time will tell, because if we have new elections in a year, there's a possibility of new elections. Things might change a bit. It will depend on who gets elected. And if not, we're going to have the same president for the next 3 years. So it's still uncertain. We still don't know, but that's how it is.
I think what's interesting about Peru is its mining laws, like Chile, have provided that consistency in spite of the political chaos. But the real risk in Peru has become, it's gone from one of the most streamlined countries in the region in terms of the regulatory path to licensing to one of the more complex, and that's hopefully something that can be tackled. Speaking of populists during campaigning and then governing from the center, the president who I think mastered this, although his second time in office, I'm not so sure that he is following that blueprint, is Lula in Brazil. Carlos, we had some big changes to the rules and regulations around mining under the Bolsonaro administration. Some of those, I think, have already been reversed by presidential decree. How do you see the Lula administration treating mining? And maybe help us understanding how, what decisions are actually decided in Brasilia versus the state capitals.
Yeah, well, starting with your last question, it's mainly federal. For the mining regulation, the states or the provinces, they mainly do the permitting, the environmental permitting. So they don't have much of a say on mining regulations. But having said that, I don't think the expectation of the industry in Brazil is that anything relevant will change under the current government. The Brazilian mining industry has had one of their best times ever during Lula's two first terms. That obviously had lots to do with the commodity prices, but there was no interference. They basically left the industry alone, and so that was good. During the Dilma government, the first Dilma government, there was an attempt to implement a radical change of the mining code, but that didn't pass in Congress. The expectation is that they would not attempt this again. And I think perhaps one of the differences between Brazil and the other Latin American countries is that mining is an important part of the economy, but it's not the biggest sector of the economy. So historically, there's not much of an attention from governments to mining is not their first priority in changing regulations and bringing in new ideas, which in a sense is very good because the industry is left to its own devices. The mining code is from '68. It hasn't been significant change since then. So anyway, long story short, I think the expectation is that there will not be any radical changes or that would impact the industry.
Okay, thank you. Another country where at least metals mining, coal mining is important, but metals mining has not been important, and therefore I would say the industry has struggled to get the attention and support of politicians, is Colombia. Álvaro, José, can you tell us, we've got, talk about politicians that campaign on the left and then govern somewhere from the center. Petro does not seem to be following that playbook. He seems to also be trying to govern from the left. And that, of course, has upset a lot of the business class. But I'm not sure how the mining industry has reacted to his governance and if they feel at all threatened.
Well, I think that it's a bit early to tell. Petro is he's a very populist politician, and he's very good at, I compare him to a sort of leftist Trump, if you will, because it's the kind of politician that governs by Twitter. So he makes a lot of announcements, but he's not very good at following through. And I think that he's only been in power for 8 months or so, and I think he's learning what the real limits of power are. So he passed a controversial but necessary tax reform. He increased taxes on a lot of industries, but that was necessary following COVID. And he has made many announcements regarding mining. He was elected on, let's say, on an environmentalist platform. Many of the left-wing politicians in Latin America have piggybacked on environmental and social preoccupations. So Petro makes a lot of announcements on environmental things. He is trying to implement a very ambitious climate change policy. And in that respect, he claims that the transition minerals are important. But many of the other, let's say, principles on which he has based his government relate to strengthening the power of communities, protecting minorities, and trying to create environmental regulations to protect water sources. So he has made many controversial announcements. He has announced that he is going to enact a new mining code, but he also wants to enact health reforms, and many other political reforms which want to give the state a greater role in the economy. I don't think he will be able to do that. Right now he has a majority in Congress, but that is contingent on many different factors. And I don't think that he will find support for a massive overhaul of the mining and other economic regulations. But just by making these announcements, he creates a lot of uncertainty, and that has very badly received by the business community.
Thanks. One politician who's had almost unfettered power since he was elected because his party controlled both levels of Congress, an increasing roster of governors as well, is Andrés Manuel López Obrador of Mexico. There's been a very interesting, his relationship with the biggest Mexican miners has been a very interesting transition from one of, I think, conflict at the beginning to one of more learning to live with each other. But Jorge, how do you see mining in Mexico today? Is there interference is there sort of legal risk facing miners from the political powers in Mexico City, or is that sort of settled down?
I mean, today there's still a very strong anti-mining feeling of the both federal and some local governments. But at the same time, no legislation has been passed to challenge the mining framework. However, in reality, the Ministry of the Environment and other ministries have blocked new permitting. There's no granting of new mining concessions. And there's very little support from the federal government for mines to operate in several communities. But at the same time, as you pointed out, AMLO, as we call him in Mexico, used to be attacking mining companies from Canada, from Mexico as well. But now it seems that he has come to terms with the mining industry to a certain extent. And he has come to certain agreements with the largest mining groups in Mexico, Mexican mining groups, such as Grupo México, who at the beginning of his administration was one of AMLO's public enemies, and not anymore. He stopped attacking Germán Larrea, who's the chairman of Grupo México, and instead has invited him to be part of his business council. So it seems that he has come at ease with the largest dominating mining groups in Mexico. But at the same time, his anti-mining stance keeps going because no new concessions have been granted, and that's a no, absolute no. And at the same time, when it comes to environmental permitting, he has clamped all of the permits. So many companies cannot further develop their operations in Mexico. So it's kind of ambiguous whether or not he's going to change the mining framework or not, because in reality it is.
Right. Thank you. In Ecuador, the election of Lasso got everybody in the mining community very excited. His first 100 days, he made all kinds of ambitious proclamations about really seeing a future for Ecuadorian mining economically. But then, of course, the sort of trench warfare of Ecuadorian politics, one of the toughest political environments, and with some new players, has slowed his ability to legislate anything. Isabel, would you like to answer on this behalf of your firm? Where do you see Ecuador today? And there was some calls for some reforms and some new legislation. What has happened to that process?
Thank you, John. And well, actually, when President Lasso got into office, he was really like a believer about mining as a booster of the local economy. And I think he's currently under like a lot of pressure, but he do believes that we need mining to boost the economy in Ecuador. However, social protests led by indigenous communities have actually put the government like against the wall, because on June last year, indigenous communities, they prepare a big and massive protest in Ecuador, and they forced the government to negotiate about some important issues in relation to audits to mining concessions and other extractive projects, and also reforms and regulations to secondary legislation. So one of the most important things is that after those negotiations, the government was about to open the mining cadastre for new concessions to be granted. However, after the pressure of the indigenous communities and other political leaders, the government decided to wait a little bit more. And what were they asking for? They were asking for a prior consultation law to be enacted before the mining cadastre is open, and also to adapt secondary environmental legislation after one of the relevant precedents of the Constitutional Court. There's a case called Los Cedros, where a couple of mining permits for concessions belonging to Cornerstone were left without effect because under the criteria of the Constitutional Court, that granting of the permits process did not comply with certain parameters or regulations about environmental consultation to the people within the process of licensing. So with all that background, and after the indigenous protests, the government decided to put the mining cadastre on hold. However, on parallel, they are taking important steps to guarantee the continuance of the projects that have been granted before the mining cadastre was closed. So now a couple of projects, a couple of bill of laws are in the National Assembly in relation to prior consultation. And one important milestone that the government also is taking these days is that prior to the bill of the prior consultation is enacted, they need to pass a regulation to perform or to execute a pre-legislative consultation, which means that any law that is affecting communities or any person in the area of influence of the mining concessions need to be socialized and consulted. So the government currently is calling out the communities and the civil society to be the participants on this process of building the laws.
Very interesting. That prior consultation is an issue that has either been treated as sort of a facade or an exercise without any teeth, but it is a rallying cry for a lot of communities and a lot of civil actors in the mining sphere. And I think what's going on in Ecuador might be very interesting, might have an influence across the region eventually. I saved Argentina for last because Argentina, as I think most people in this room understand, is a unique jurisdiction in Latin America. It's the most decentralized, where the provinces have as much or more say than the national government, which I would say has been a saving grace for Argentina's mining industry historically, given the politics we've seen go through Buenos Aires. Ignacio, help us understand what's going on in Argentina today. We're going to be having elections in October of this year. There'll probably be a change, at least at the presidential level. Is that going to have an impact? How do you see the provinces treating mining today?
Thank you for the invitation. And you're correct. One of the things that Argentina, when you see it through mining lenses, is the importance and power of the provincial government. As a federal country, almost all environmental and regulatory jurisdiction relies on the provincial government, and really depends on the policy that the government of those provinces see mining, how you can develop projects around. That's why even for a while now, basically Argentina is divided by what we call mining provinces or anti-mining provinces, but the path is going more to an acceptance of mining, almost in the traditionally most anti-mining provinces. Even Chubut and Mendoza, which were the examples of those, are actively trying to develop mining. There is a view from the governors, which actually makes basic sense from a logical perspective, that mining is something that can enhance direct investment, which is a traditionally Argentinian problem because of our macroeconomic situation. To have direct investment is very difficult. And the provinces sees mining as a source of it. And when you go from a national perspective, really, as it has happened in other countries as talk, there is a difficulty to pass legislation national that will significantly impact on mining itself. So we have had decades ago issues like the glacial law and things that were disruptive of mining, but really without much teeth. Few projects really did not go forward through this type of legislation, even though they were very conflicted in the media and in the political sphere. And I think the trend is going to be to allow more mining projects, particularly now the drive is to copper, and Argentina has untapped copper potential for decades, and therefore it seems like it will be difficult to see that the governments will not try to support this one way or the other one. Obviously, in the frame that we are all talking, is one of the things by now I think we should stop worrying about is political risk and uncertainty, because we have to live with that. We know that mining is long-term investment, it's 40 years and all the things, but politicians don't care, people don't care, and we are the ones that have to change our frame and have what I usually said. One thing is the strategy you have, but other one is the tactics you use to go to those goals, and your tactics change with the flow of political fear. So I see that Argentina in that way is going to be positive. Obviously, the biggest challenge I think on mining, again, I'm not talking about the framework of investment as macroeconomic, because that's very difficult, obviously, is that mining itself have not still get into the DNA of the Argentinian economy. Even from in business environment, mining never has been strong. So the provincial governments and even the national government now sees as a source of, getting exports, getting money into the country, getting direct investment, but they don't really understand it that much. And the mining business community has always struggled to make itself understand. And until that situation stabilizes a little bit, that has always going to be a challenge. So again, I see that the outlook for development of project should be fairly favorable. I don't see big changes coming around. Obviously, they will change the economic conditions of the project for sure. If you're very profitable, people want to tax you more. It's how it works. But the moving forward will be, supported, but by governments that usually don't know how to support you that well. And that's the challenge that is going to be around, and that's what you need to see around it. And I'll get one last second. The national election, you're right, probably it's very difficult to foresee right now what it will come, because we are ruled by a coalition that has strong internal fights, and the opposition is another coalition that has very strong internal fights. So that's, again, another point that someone should be a little more colorblind of who gets elected, and then see how they analyze their tactics regarding who ends up in power, because it's very difficult to predict what's going to go at the national level. It's easy to see at provincial level, and whatever the governor gets elected is going to more or less follow the path that I mentioned. They don't have much choice.
Thank you, Ignacio. The second subject we want to touch on today is security. And again, security is challenging to look at as a single issue, because often what's driving security or insecurity is political in nature or involves other actors, both illicit and legal. And security is always an issue for any mining operation around the world. But there's 3 countries in particular in Latin America where I think security is a big enough concern that it does involve politics and it does involve other issues. And that's Mexico, Colombia, and Peru. And in particular, I'd like to hear from our panelists from those countries around what they're hearing from miners when miners approach them to invest in their countries. What are the concerns or the perceptions that they have? How do the experienced miners in your countries deal with security issues? And specifically, how is it that they negotiate? This same panel, we were here 4 years ago talking about the need to sometimes negotiate with illicit groups that happen to have control over a territory where the mine is. And you might not want to deal with them directly, but perhaps through an interlocutor. And the Canadian lawyers in the room sort of threw up their hands and said, I can't advise my mining clients to deal with narcos. But if the narcos are controlling the territory where your mine is, you're probably going to have to deal with them. So given that reference, let me start with Mexico and have you answer those questions.
Sure. Insecurity has been a very, very serious issue for the past a couple of decades at the very least, especially triggered by organized crime and the drug trafficking phenomenon in Mexico. And under the current administration, President López Obrador has this hands-off stance against organized crime. He has this slogan of bullets, no bullets, but hugs. So basically, he's not going after the organized crime gangs who operate in lots of northern states and central states where mining activities take place. So it's a very, very serious problem there, and investors are really concerned about it. You see many illegal blockades, sometimes organized by the narco gangs because they don't want any attention from the police or the military forces to be into the areas where they operate. So you also see the narcos changing its business framework. They're just not after drug trafficking anymore. They're also into kidnapping, into extortion, and many other illicit activities. So they are targeting mining companies. You can read in the newspapers that some of the directors of foreign companies are having kidnapped or extortion, and that's something that happens on a daily basis, sadly to say. And there's very little support from the federal government, I have to say, to combat this phenomenon. So companies have hired their own private security, and also they have invested a lot of time and effort in building good relationships with the communities through their corporate social responsibility departments, trying to forge long-term relationships with the communities with good employment, good salaries, investments in education, in infrastructure, and they have gained the confidence of local communities. And in exchange, these local communities have helped them out with combating all these security threats to a certain extent. And yes, some companies do hire specialized firms to negotiate with organized crime and gangs operating in the areas. That's probably the only way to deal with that because, there are very important mines in states like Sinaloa, Sonora, Chihuahua, where there's very, very strong organized crime gangs. So sometimes the only way to keep operating in those areas is to negotiate through specialized teams of experts.
Thank you. Another country that has a history of security issues, although one could argue that it's certainly a much safer country today than it was 20 years ago, is Colombia. But the Plan Colombia, what it did was it sort of decapitated a very consolidated organized criminal structure and created a very fragmented one, which can be in very small local communities can be just as unsettling. We have a new government. I'm not sure, Petro is reforming the army, that he's seen as a threat to some of his constituents in the past. Some people are concerned that this is going to have a negative impact on the safety of rural communities. And it's those rural communities where mines tend to be operating. So, Álvaro, what is your sense of the security issues today in Colombia and going forward?
Yes, well, I think you're right. I would say that the main security challenge for many years was extortion from large organized illegal armed groups, and I think that challenge is no longer the major concern. I would say that the more pressing concern these days is the infiltration by some of these illegal armed groups of social protest, and I think that what we're seeing today is a challenge where certain social groups are manipulated by illegal armed actors, and they are induced into actions of sabotage and things that affect the operation of the mining companies. And it's very hard to deal with that because it requires a combination of support from the armed forces and the police, but also negotiation and social programs. And it's very hard to tell to what extent a demand from the community is legitimate, and if it's not dealt with, at what point that will escalate into violence. And this very week we are seeing an armed protest in the Bajo Cauca, where there's a lot of gold production, and paradoxically that has been caused by the government's policies. The minister of Environment visited the region recently, and they realized that there's a lot, of course, of illegal gold production, which is having very serious environmental impact. So they ordered the army to go in and stop some of the illegal operations, and they even destroyed some dredges and things like that. And that has created like a massive backlash, which is creating a big problem for some of the legal operators there. So it is challenging. In the past, what companies have done, and this is legal in Colombia, is to enter into agreements with the army for them to deploy troops to the areas of operation in exchange for monetary contributions and non-lethal support by the companies. It has always been controversial, but it has been validated by the Constitutional Court. But with this government and the mutual distrust between the military and the new government, it's hard to tell whether that will continue to be an option. So having good intelligence is really important. As Jorge was saying, having excellent engagement with the communities and trying to make sure that the communities are not infiltrated by other actors and that you don't end up inadvertently funding illegal actors by funding community programs is really important.
Right. Great point. Another country where we had long forgotten and we had not seen, at least in the international media, images of violence for many, many years is Peru, a country that become very safe, become very popular as a tourist destination. So the recent images of conflict that erupted after the removal of Castillo and his supporters sort of took to the streets caused a lot of concern. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure if that translates into risk to miners. So, Oscar, as you know, there's a huge illegal or artisanal or informal, depending on what adjective you want to use, gold mining industry. Something like, I think, 75% of gold that's mined in Peru is done through this informal mining. Is security an issue to miners today, and what are the origins of that risk?
It's a tricky question because it depends on how you define insecurity here. In Peru, the general term of insecurity is more understood as what happened in the big cities, which there's been some escalation of insecurity in the last years. After COVID, we are seeing it more. But in the rural areas or in the provinces where mining is located, insecurity in terms of organized crime, I wouldn't say it is a problem. The problem has to do with, and this is an overstatement, of course, but I would say generally with two sources. The first one, in certain areas, have to do with illegal mining. Illegal mining in Peru has become a power. a real power, and not only behind the curtains, seems to be gaining some political power. There's some evidence that our former president Castillo has had very close ties with illegal miners. Illegal mining in Peru, it's the numbers, and of course you can't say which the real numbers are. Apparently, in gold, they could be exporting around $1.8 billion every year. And that's a big number in Peru. Okay? But tackling illegal mining is very difficult because unlike drug dealing, which is an illegal business with an illegal product, illegal mining has a legal product at the end of the day, which is a metal. So it's difficult to tackle it, and the ramifications in certain areas of the country have now become evident in the political structures, in the judicial structures, and even in some security forces. So they have the money, they have the power, and it's a very good business for them. In terms of the mining operations in Peru, I would say that in proportion of the number of mines, not many mines have been affected by security issues. But some big ones, very representative mines have. And that has been translated into blockade of roads. With, in Peru, kind of becoming a national sport to block a road. It's very easy. There's harsh legal consequences that are never effective. So people decide that they have to block a highway, a national road. They can do it, and it's fairly easy to do it. And in most cases, the police and the armed forces will wait. They're patient to take you out of there. They will wait for a while, and sometimes they won't do it because of political concerns, right? And there's this case of a very large mine in Peru, which is Las Bambas, which is MMG-controlled Las Bambas. Las Bambas, to give you an idea, represented a 10 billion plus investment. So by far is the largest investment in Peruvian history. Well, these guys they had to stop their production for a while because they weren't able to take supplies into the mine because people were blocking it. And in that case, there were, I would say, those blockades are not related to social or concerns or demands that sometimes and most times are pretty fair. In this case, it's and this is what the Bambas officers say now because they've changed their speech, extortion. There's a legal scheme, unfortunately a lot of lawyers behind it, that put together a scheme to try to take more money from the company, facade of social concerns, but no, this is and I think that the authorities are now being conscious that that's the case. So they are treating this differently, a bit differently. So in a nutshell, you cannot treat, at least in my view, all the security issues the same. There are security issues. If someone blocks you, it's a security issue. If someone doesn't let you pass, it's a security issue. But they might have different motivations, and therefore they should be dealt differently. And to finish, what my friends were saying, which is absolutely essential, is to have a strong engagement relationship with your local communities. The problem being in Peru now is that everyone wants to be your local community. Not only the guy that is 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers now, the guy that's 50 kilometers away. They all want to be in your area of influence. They fight for that, and that's a problem as well.
So that takes us quite perfectly into the next subject, which is community relations and community opposition. The illegal mining, one of the reasons why politicians refer to as informal mining or artisanal mining is because when you attack it and when you demonize it, you're demonizing what is often very small groups of people who are supporting families who've been mining for hundreds of years. So you're attacking the entire community when you attack illegal mining in certain contexts. There are other contexts where those illegal miners are backed by some pretty nasty folks and are very powerful and very wealthy and are capable of extortion. But it's a tricky thing, and a lot of mining companies have changed the way they deal with informal mining. In some cases, they will allow them to continue mining on their property as long as they process that gold and ensure that the quality of the mining operations, the safety of the mining operations, and most importantly, the environmental operability of the informal mining, because informal minings are infamous for using cyanide and other poisonous chemicals that formal miners no longer use. So this notion of community is key. About 10 years ago, we identified this as the biggest risk today in Latin America for mining companies. I think it's a more balanced equation between different risks, but the reason communities have become such a source of risk in part is because those communities, thanks to smartphones, suddenly had a voice. So you couldn't, if you're a miner and you're being blockaded, the old blueprint was call in the army, they'll clear out the protesters, and the mine continues. But today, there'll be someone with a smartphone filming that, and it'll be put on a website, and with the help of NGOs and others, it will gain global viewership. Most central governments in Latin America today do not have a stronghold on power. And if they are confronting the visual opposition of their own armed forces, beating up local communities, it's over for them. So they have very much pulled back in the exercising the power through the military, which is giving communities that much more of a voice. I would say today that you need to spend as much time courting local communities as you spend courting ministers of mining or anyone else. In fact, if you show up to a mine in a coche blindado with the minister of mines in the next car, and you all get out in suits, and that's how you first meet the local community, you've already lost. You have to be friends with the community first. So, but that's not easy. As Oscar pointed out and Álvaro José pointed out, community is the solution to dealing with political interference, with security, and with other issues. It is a complex world that you will find in these seemingly simple places. So I want to ask all of our panelists to address community opposition and community relations and tell us about things like what are the concerns typically of these communities in their opposition to mining? Are mining companies doing a good job or not at courting and working with communities? What is the role of local community referendum? We talked about prior consultation, which is often in the form of a local referendum. What is the role of these local referendums? Are they important to gaining just social license, or do they also have an impact legally on their operations? So those are some of the issues. Ecuador, want to go first? This is a big issue, of course, in Ecuador.
Definitely, John, and thank you. Yes, well, in Ecuador, local social protests and the opposition of the communities to mining has been a big issue, and I was actually talking about that. Like now, the stability of the government, it's depending on this social protest and the indigenous communities wanting mining or extractive industry or no. And what is going on now is that, the government is putting on hold some decisions in relation to boosting the mining economy, even though they know that we need mining to boost the country. At the very beginning, the government made some public statements in order to attract foreign investors. But now the government is struggling with attracting foreign investors and also keeping the NGOs and the environmentalists happy. So they are trying to get a stability by promoting the projects that are ongoing and just putting on hold other important political decisions. Another thing that it's impacting the relationship with the communities is also illegal mining, because usually the social movements they have behind illegal miners, and the biggest threat to mining in Ecuador, I would have to say, is illegal mining. And there's also the lack of knowledge of the industry in Ecuador. In Ecuador, we're just beginning as a mining country. We have only 2 projects into the exploitation phase. So most people think that by granting mining concessions, you will have a mine from day to night. That if the government opens the mining cadastre, they will have 300, 500 mining concessions that will become a mine. And that's a very big issue, because what the government is trying to do is that they need to educate people and the next generations to believe that mining can be done in a proper way and how mining is actually done. And this also has to do with referendum and popular consultations, because now you have a scope of voters who are from 16 to 20. So this new generation is empowering environmental organizations because there's a big lack of knowledge of the industry. So the next generations who are the voters now, in a case of a popular consultation or referendum deciding whether to prohibit or not mining activities, they must, in most of the cases, they have said no to mining. And in Ecuador, the good thing is that taking the decision about prohibiting mining on a global or a national basis is still a decision of the national government. It's the president and the executive power, the one who has to decide on that. However, sectional governments, we just had elections of sectional governments. It was a big surprise that the indigenous political party took over most of the sectional governments in the country. And now they are, of course, trying to put another sectional popular consultation to prohibit mine. So the people has to vote on the regions to decide whether mining could be done or no. But at the end, for Ecuador to become a mining country is still a decision of the president and the executive branch.
Okay, thank you. Gonzalo, in Chile, mining years ago moved out of its concentration in the north, which is underpopulated and arid, towards the south into areas that are considered pristine and wilderness, and that has caused great concern, including local communities. Can you talk about how things have changed and the importance of communities in Chile?
Yes, I mean, in Chile, you have to distinguish between the north, where the mining industry has the biggest presence. And then if you go to the south, there is an area without too much mining activities, but other natural resources where communities it's an issue because they have territorial reclamations and it's not easy to deal with them. And then if you go even southern, then there's areas that are much sensitive, but I think the communities there are not so different from those on the north. And basically, in my opinion, Chilean communities are communities that are pacific, not violent, except for this specific area in what we call the Araucanía. And they're very well organized in terms of defending their rights and participate actively during the process to obtain the environmental license. In Chile is part of the ILO convention, and consultation process is mandatory during the process of obtaining the environmental license, but it's not mandatory to reach an agreement with the communities. So basically, the mining project that has been rejected during the environmental application process has been rejected because the consultation process was not done correctly. And basically because we were understanding how to do that consultation process. Communities distrust from the government. However, the government is the entity in between the mining companies and the communities. And when we became part of the ILO, we were like the good student of the region. I mean, we raised the hands, but we never did the homework. So that was 15 years ago. But I believe that thing has been changed in a positive way because our authorities, our court have a better understanding how to harmonize all these regulations and how to apply them toward communities. But mostly because the mining company have taken a very active role in engaging with communities on a very preliminary phase. So, I don't know, when I was a young associate, I can remember a mining company considering or being worried about a community during an early exploration prospect. Now, mining companies have a much different attitude, and they engage with community. They study the potential impact, even from a exploration campaign, the mitigation measures. They try to understand the communities, and basically they are trying to build long-term relationship and trust. And this is the best thing, because I believe that mining in Chile can live in a pacific way with communities, but you need to engage early with them. So they get to know you. Normally, communities are really fearing all the risks of the negative impact of activities without understanding the potential benefit. But mining company has been taking the lead on this, and this create, I believe, a good environmental for company, especially in the north. We have an area which is complicated one, but there are some rare minerals projects there that might face some problems, but it's a very limited area. So,
thank you. You know, this notion of communities that are accustomed to mining, are comfortable with it, understand it, versus those that are new to, is, I think, a big driver of getting over the misinformation around mining. Brazil is a country with enormous variety of jurisdictions. You have Minas Gerais, who's been mining for hundreds of years, a place that everyone's comfortable with mining, and then you have new discoveries in the north, which brings a new phenomenon of mining to these communities. Carlos, how do you see? It's hard to generalize about anything in Brazil. It's such a huge country, but how do you see mining companies adapting to particularly new jurisdictions, the notion of community opposition?
Right. Thanks, John. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, there's a difference between communities in the south and communities in the north. So the southern part of the country, it has lived with mining for much longer. Towns in many operations, towns have grown around the mining operation. So it's a different kind of relationship. In the north, mines are more isolated, but usually there are indigenous communities around. So it's a very different relationship. And going back to Oscar's point, these days it's hard to say what an affected community is, because it's very different from the past. It was more straightforward in the past. Now it's challenging to actually define what an affected community is. So obviously, as you all know, Brazil unfortunately had the two incidents with tailings dams, and that obviously affected dramatically communities, and that had an effect in all of the industry, not just the companies involved with the incidents, but the industry had to react, to have to regain trust, which was completely lost, not just with the companies involved with the incidents, but throughout the industry, and it has improved. I mean, they're sort of forced to do it, and it has improved. And it's I think they have much more of resources, human resources, financial resources, ability, capacity to deal with communities. And I don't know if this is true in other Latin American countries, but in Brazil there is a unique system of monitoring environment and social issues. So there's an independent body, which we call Ministério Público, are the prosecutors, that are not part of government. They are not part of the judiciary. They are a completely autonomous and independent body. And they can represent communities, even if the communities do not ask them to do it. And that body is what usually are more active than the communities themselves. And so a lot of issues, especially after the tailings dams incidents, they've become much more active. And the worst thing that can happen, and it has happened in certain circumstances and certain projects, is that issues are taken to court. And then companies and communities lose their ability, almost lose their ability to negotiate. So for investors in Brazil, the advice usually is the companies have to be prepared to do the best they can to avoid that prosecutors get involved and permitting or other issues end up in court. Because as I mentioned, then it's someone that does not have mining experience, that doesn't necessarily understand communities, doesn't understand the benefits or the risks or the challenges deciding. And that's the worst thing that can happen.
Very interesting. One country you don't hear a lot of community opposition problems, in part because of the relatively isolated locations of most mines, is Argentina. But nonetheless, there's certainly been some incidents in recent years. Ignacio, can you share your how are mining companies dealing with communities?
Yeah. First of all, sorry. Yeah. First of all, to exactly the joke, you basically the communities that are connected close to a project has you cannot do anything without an agreement first, and the authorities have been very clear that in order to process your environmental permit, first you have to have an agreement with the community. And mining companies have been quite active in having engaged with communities way much more in advance than the decision to develop, construct, or put forward a project. So even though the impression generally that can be that in Argentina communities are not a bigger factor like in other countries with more history of mining, or it's true Argentina has a very big territory and mines usually are isolated, that should not be seen as that community involvement is not important. I think that is more critical than government relationships. The second thing is communities, depending on where you are, if there's a community that is close to the project, usually you cut a deal. There is no real opposition from the communities close to the project itself. Certainly there is a bargain without standards because the community knows that they have a big leverage at the beginning. Then as the project advances, this shift changes a little bit because you are the major employer in the area, you are the major resource of funding and developing in the community many times because of the isolation of where these projects are. So that's to have a good understanding from the beginning, and a fair understanding is important because you will have, regardless of what you have written, your involvement with the community will evolve as long as the project moves forward. What you have in Argentina as well is if you have the bad luck to be too much in the press, or as it happened in Esquel in 2000 and some other areas, or in Mendoza, if there is a provincial population opposition to mining for whatever reason, as happened in Mendoza, as it happened in Chubut, then it's very difficult to overturn sentiment of population against mining that goes beyond the project area. And that is more difficult for even with national government, provincial government, national government trying to overturn these restrictions, it's difficult because, and this is going to the last point that I say, is we miners more or less put themselves in the spot here in the way that obviously you want sustainability, always you want to have a development and an impact relationship with the community that goes forward with the project. But at the same time, the mining industry itself has been dealing this one-to-one, company to project with community and things like that. And I think it needs to start evolving a little bit, at least at provincial level, in which you have to have more programs and sustainability issues in which the companies are involved that not only helps the community close to the project, but helps the province itself and even at national level. And that cannot be done by one company, it has to do by the industry itself. Because when you can have a good relationship with the community, but as I said, in Mendoza or Chubut, if the province is against, there's nothing you can do. And there have been projects that have been stopped for decades. And now there is not clear burdens of what the objective is. There is a confusion between sustainability and support, with replacing the government in social plans, in social infrastructure, in social things. And again, it's miners have put itself there, and therefore, they will have to deal with that with a more community action among the companies between all. The last point that I will say on this, we have consultation and they have this leverage. We have been very worried, and I think everybody more or less agrees, of having polls or plebiscitos, as we call it, elections around giving the permit or not, because this is a very different environment, and you are not a political party, and you don't know how to do campaigns. And the only time that there was an election for yes or no into a project, it was clearly a disaster because it gets all meddled into politics. So I'll be pretty worried if, in other countries they go through this process, or they think that on a technical permit you have a yes or no type of thing, because once that you are getting into this structure, even if it's for yes, it's going to be very difficult to move the burden into rationality again. So that's a little bit the scope.
Great, thanks. And for those of you, we keep hearing this notion of a referendum or prior consultation. This dates back to a UN resolution signed literally, I believe, in 89 or 90 at the end of the Cold War, that said in protection of, in recognition of indigenous peoples, if indigenous peoples' lands or claims to lands are anywhere near a mine, there will be a prior consultation. And in the interest of Latin American countries coming out of the Cold War and wanting to be a party to sort of a progressive international vote, they all signed up for it without sort of understanding the legal repercussions. And that's why there's still this ongoing issue, because when you cede that political power or that investment decision power to a local community, like you just very well put, Ignacio, mining companies they're not politicians, and so their ability to win approval is, on the merits of the mine, that's one thing, but when you have all of these other actors behind community opposition, it becomes an issue. And I want to turn to Mexico on this, because community opposition is so often interwoven with security concerns, which Jorge already articulated, but also mining unions, which in most cases in Latin America are bad actors in mining operations, working against mining companies, often in cahoots with some of these illicit groups. So, Jorge, You've touched on this a little bit, but and I agree with you. If you can get the community on side, they can actually be a great counterbalance. But what happens when that community is so influenced by these other actors? How do mining companies deal with that?
We could say that Mexico can be divided into two. The northern part of Mexico used to mining for 500 or more years, and the southern part, which is not so used to mining operations and has the largest number of indigenous communities. And that's a very important factor to take into consideration. Also, as John is pointing out, mining unions play a very important role when it comes to mining consultation, and also organized crime in cahoots with fake NGOs stir up the mining scene, in order to object certain mining projects. And that has been the case in several parts of the country, where the environmental feasibility of the project has been approved by the authorities, but then this indigenous consultation, this referendum, has become a tool for extortion. Also, mining unions and some other stakeholders in the communities have taken advantage of this ILO 169 consultation process, and also have taken advantage of a lack of clear regulation as to indigenous and community consultation. So at the end of the day, rather than favoring a transparent process which would benefit the communities, it has become, in most of the cases, I would say, a tool of extortion. And recently, environmental permitting was not fully conditioned upon obtaining social licensing or exhausting the indigenous consultation. But just recently, last Friday, the Supreme Court of Justice issued 2 new precedents, which makes it mandatory to carry out the indigenous consultation prior to obtaining the environmental permitting. And it has said that you don't have to prove that there's going to be any serious environmental impact in the community in order for the mining companies to exhaust the indigenous consultation. So it seems that it's going to be, it's radicalizing this process in Mexico, and it's going to become quite complex to deal with in the future.
Thank you. In Colombia, I worked for a couple of years on a project where you had good support from mining in Bogota, but the local community was the source of the slowdown, and in Antioquia, in a traditionally pro-mining province. So it's interesting, even within or a department, and even within a local jurisdiction, you can have at a much more micro level areas of opposition. Colombia is a complicated place because of the illegal mining that goes on and other sources of opposition. But how are you seeing mining companies dealing with local communities?
Yeah, well, I think you can have a situation like the one you just described, or sometimes exactly the opposite. And I mean, in the Sotonorte project from Guadalajara is a good example. In there, the local community that comes from what the area is a traditional mining area. The local community is all for the project, and regional and national politicians and NGOs are against the project. So sometimes you have the community on your side, they really want the project, and then you have these external actors that come along and oppose the project. And of course, the strategies are very different. In the case of where you have, let's say, opposition by the local community, mining formalization becomes very important, and you have several companies in Colombia that operate in Antioquia in areas where there is, and this is also another important point, there's a big difference between the law and the facts on the ground. So in Colombia, the law has tried to make distinctions between illegal and artisanal mining, but on the ground, that distinction is very difficult to make. I mean, if you see a person with a pan in a river, maybe that's an artisanal miner. But when that person evolves and now becomes able to buy a bulldozer, then maybe he becomes or she becomes illegal. So it's a difficult distinction to make. But the point is that companies have created programs, as you mentioned, John, where they formalize titles and they process the gold that the communities obtain. And that goes a long way towards, incorporating communities and providing benefits for them, and creating more stability for the project. But sometimes the greater opposition from local communities comes from communities in areas where there is no traditional mining activity. And we have plenty of projects in Colombia where the footprint of the project is going to take place in an area that has been traditionally devoted to agriculture. And people are very wary of the project because they think that it's going to change their way of life. It's going to bring a whole new population into the territory. It's going to increase salaries and prices. And sometimes you have local farmers who are afraid because they will no longer be able to hire people because the salaries that the mining companies are paying are a lot higher. And they are also concerned because everyone has in their, let's say, the image of mining in Colombia is sometimes created by illegal miners. So people have these images of terrible environmental damages that are caused mostly by illegal mining, and they associate that to large-scale mining. So it is very difficult, and once again, you have to engage, you have to educate, you have to talk to the NGOs, you have to talk to the government, But it's difficult. I mean, sometimes if you have the local community on your side, definitely that's the best. I think that at the end of the day, the local community has to benefit, and I think it's fair to say that in some projects there are no sufficient benefits, but only burdens to the community. But it's very hard to tell, when up to what point you are benefiting the community and when it becomes extortive, which in many cases it does.
Great. I want to give last word on this issue to Oscar from Peru, Peru being the country that has dealt with this, I think, most visibly over the last decade. And then I know we've run over time. I appreciate everyone's patience. We'll certainly happy to answer any of your questions. I didn't want to cut us short. I think, as you can see, the dialogue has been very rich. Oscar, over to you.
Thanks. I'm going to be brief then. As you say, Peru is a mining country, historic, emblematic country. We've been doing mining before we played football. So we've been doing this for 1,000 years, right? And all over the country. It would be a gross mistake to say that Peruvian communities are anti-mining. Sometimes that's a narrative that some people want to convey because that's part of another agenda. I've worked in tens of projects, exploration projects, and as a matter of law and as a matter of reason, if you do not have an agreement with a community, which in a lot of cases is the owner of the surface land that you need to lease or to purchase to do your project, then you just can do nothing. And I've seen tens and hundreds of agreements with communities. Sometimes they are not easy to reach, but they are doable. What you see sometimes in the news, and which is true, is some community opposition, but to certain projects. And those projects have their own history. Sometimes the companies didn't do their homework correctly. They actually did it very bad. And that explains sometimes things. We cannot think that the mining industry is perfect. No, it isn't. There are mistakes committed. Sometimes one mistake that I've seen now, it's not made that often, is to believe that you, within a country, can deal with communities with the same recipe. That's not true. Every community has its own history with mining, has its own needs, its own approach. And believe me when I tell you that at least in Peru, communities now know that they can get things for their life improvement from mining companies. Because unfortunately, the government, the state, is not efficient. And they have to turn to someone else. And then they know that. The problem is that sometimes in big projects, this only happens if you have a very big project actually, you will get some opposition. And that opposition sometimes have to do with fair concerns and demands from local populations, but sometimes has a very heavy political influence from local political groups that have their own platform, their own agenda. And these days, sometimes from illegal miners that don't like formal mining to be present in the areas where they operate. It's not a good idea for them. So again, the recipes don't treat everyone the same. Engage us from day -1 with the communities. They are all going to be different, and it is perfectly possible to reach agreement with them. A lot of time in stages, you reach an agreement for the first year, 2 years, then you struck additional agreements. The demands are going to be different, and to end. It would be very naive to think that when you sign an agreement with a community, that agreement is not going to change. That's a lawyerly perspective of things. That is going to change throughout time. You have to be prepared to sit down and renegotiate. It's like royalties and taxes. Governments are going to change from time. So you have to be dynamic in that.
Great, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. We're happy to field any questions. I'm not sure if any questions have come in online as well. Anyone like to? Yes, please.
Yeah, this is a question for Oscar regarding Peru. You mentioned, and it has been reported in the press, the effect of the road closures. You mentioned in Las Bambas, but I understand there are others that, either they have even closed the mining operations or they cannot take product out. And the question is the government really taking a proactive actions to solve that, or the government is hands off and the problem continues and it's just putting it on the hands of the mining company to get it resolved?
In the last 2 weeks or month, they are doing something. Before that, with our prior today imprisoned President Castillo, they did very little. And they actually didn't want to do much. They used that as a political tool for bargaining with their own, as they say in Spanish, bases políticas, no? Now they have a different perspective, but you have to understand that this now in Peru in the context of a weak government. When I was saying at the beginning that we had 6 presidents in 7 years, the good thing is that they all were constitutionally either elected or placed into power. So there's no more coup or that kind of 70s stuff in Peru. That has changed. But that doesn't mean that they're strong. That doesn't mean that they can actually do what they should do at the time in which they should do. What we have seen in the last months in Peru, as if you follow the news in Peru, unfortunately we have had some basically focused in the southern part of the country, in the southern Andes, where there's a lot of mines over there as well, demonstrations. And there have been violent demonstrations in some areas. And unfortunately, as far as I remember, 45 people were killed. And that's a lot of people, right? Now that has come down, and the process and the approach that the government had was let them demonstrate for a while, and after some time, they decided to intervene. And something that I was telling John about is how this is kind of a paradox. In Peru, to be transparent, blunt, and honest, and politically incorrect, as I like to be, we don't trust much the police and the armed forces. We see them as sometimes corrupt, right? But I have to say that I've been very proud of how they, with the limitations, the political limitations that they were given without the will of the politicians to let them work, and with little resources, logistical resources, they just did what they had to do. They were careful. Perhaps there were some excesses committed, but they've been able to stall down these demonstrators, some of which were very, very violent. They were not excessively large groups, but when you see the X-ray of some of those demonstrations, some of them were infiltrated by former Shining Path guys that they've been in prison for 30 years, which is the maximum term you can be in prison in Peru. And now they're out because Shining Path was defeated 30 years ago. So these guys, prison doesn't help to resocialize people in Peru necessarily, and they are out in the streets again. So that is not, of course, the only explanation. It's just a factor. But it's a very complex situation, and we are now doing things. Hopefully, we will continue to do it.
Any more questions? Any come in online? No? Okay, please.
3 quick comments. Number one, I think the framework on COVID in Mexico does not apply. Actually, the government kept control, the party in power kept control of Congress, and they gained several governorships. So I think we're an outlier in that case. As regards the attitude of the Mexican government towards mining, you can see the best example at the trade show. For the first time in many, many, many years, the Mexican federal government that has jurisdiction over mining does not have a booth. It was taken over by the state of Chihuahua. This was support of the mining cluster of Chihuahua, the private companies. So for the first time, the Mexican government is not here, I would say, in decades. And finally, adding to Jorge's comments on indigenous consultation, I think one of the biggest threats right now in Mexico is precisely that subject. Because if you go to, for example, Almadine Minerals website, you will see that they had 2 concessions canceled due to the lack of indigenous consultation. They are being reprocessed, but now the government has rejected those, saying they had technical defects, things that were filed 20 years ago. So I believe that the biggest threat in Mexico right now actually does not come from from just the federal government's attitude, but from these judicial decisions that have placed now any mining concession in an indigenous area that did not do consultation, which means all of them, in jeopardy. So,
Great points. Jorge, I don't know if you want to respond.
No, I fully agree. Part of the security issues, as I said before, the indigenous consultation, it's the biggest threat for investors these days. Because now, their concession titles and licenses are at jeopardy because anyone can file a claim against those mineral licenses, claiming that there was no indigenous consultation properly exhausted, and therefore they could be canceled or reversed. So, a part of the de facto issues surrounding the mining operations, this is clearly the biggest threat to private investment. And as I said, those two precedents which were issued last Friday really are serious.
Right. Thank
licenses.
you. At this point, I'd like to ask Michael Bourassa of Fasken to come up and close the session. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, John. That was a great session. I think we really should give the panel a round of applause for what they've done today. Before I make some final comments, I just want to put a plug in for the International Foundation Conference in Mexico City. Many of you here are on the committees, planning committees, and some in the audience are on the planning committee. So please make plans to be there April 19 to 21 in beautiful Mexico City. I'm looking forward to it. Our next PDAC session is at lunchtime today. It's Accelerating Project Permitting is Indigenous Equity and Answer. So that'll be at noon. I guess the lunch will start at noon. It'll be live for the audience out there that's watching at 12:30 Toronto time. And you can sign up for any of the other sessions going to our website at fasken.com. And our last session will be this afternoon on critical minerals. I think that starts at 4:30. I believe 4:30 is the actual video time. So anyway, thank you everyone for coming today. It was a great session. Thank you.